Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our monthly IERG Global Leader webinar. Most of you have missed us, hopefully, in July when we all took in August when we took a well-deserved break. I hope you had a good summer, if you are in the Northern Hemisphere, of course. But we are great to be back. We have a super lineup for the next few months, starting off today with generations in the workforce. As you all know, we all work in a work environment where there are multiple generations working. In some organizations, it works well. In some organizations, the bigger ones, the global ones, difficult. Specifically, if you start looking at different cultural dynamics, if you're looking at larger virtual teams, and the question: how do you, as a leader, run a group of individuals scattered all over the world, different time zones, different cultures? It's really, really hard. So our aim is today to talk about this situation, generations in the workforce, and we have a fantastic, distinguished speaker today to address us on a specific topic. I will introduce Dr. Ted Cross shortly. Allow me first a word from the sponsor, of course, IERG. We are a global network of senior executive professionals. We've all had significant careers in international markets. And the aim of IERG is to promote our businesses, and for people who want to develop the leadership, we offer a fantastic leadership track and certification program. So if you want to know more, we'll be happy to share with you some information. Our goal is to share knowledge. We are a thought leader, and we bring distinguished global thought leaders to the podium, as we are doing today. We want to share best practices, resources, contacts, global market perspectives, and of course, provide support to each other's careers and business interests. We offer a range of best-in-class benefits to our corporate members as well. We are so happy to have a number of corporate members as sponsors, and I will thank them in a short while. You'll see them at the bottom of the screen. For more information regarding our membership tiers and corporate sponsorship, please do visit our website. Let me just quickly give you some important notice reminders. We've spoken about this before. We will have our inaugural Global Growth and Trends Symposium on October the 25th in New York. Our colleagues under the leadership of Joanna Peters, she's done a remarkable job to get a star-studded cast and speakers ready for you. It's going to be at a fantastic venue, something that IERG has never seen. So please reserve your seat. There are few seats left. It's going to be a great event, super networking opportunity, and we definitely urge you to go if you have not registered yet. To register, of course, go to globalbusinesssymposium.iergonline.org. For more information about our upcoming events and webinars, iergonline.com/calendar. You'll find a complete list of our upcoming events, chapter events, virtual chapter events, physical events, meetings. So please have a look at there to see what's coming up. We have great events on a monthly basis. So this is where we meet and greet and share information. That's the purpose of IERG. A special word of thanks today to our corporate sponsors who go far beyond and help us drive our own business and their own, of course. Thanks to Health Focus, Art Buckland, Arcs Equity, Mike Lorelli and Landing Board Seats, CR Worldwide, Stratcon Global, White & Williams LLP, and BDO. We really, really value their support. Of course, we welcome new corporate sponsors as well. Please have a look at our websites, and happy to share with you any information. As I said, today we are talking about generations in the workplace, and to help us on this specific topic, let me introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Ted Cross. Dr. Cross is a clinical assistant professor of leadership and management, as well as the director of the online Master of Applied Leadership and Management program at Thunderbird School of Global Management. As you can see on the screen, clearly we are talking today to someone who knows about the subject. He teaches it, and he's been around. He's a subject matter expert, and we are so delighted, Ted, to have you here today. Tricky subject for many organizations. I know I've spoken to large organizations, including some of the big four, and they're battling. This is really, really a challenge for most companies. So we are really interested to hear from you today and learn from you. So what are international best practices and what can we learn from that? Just a word, please. We would like you to participate. Any questions you may have, there's a questions dialog box in the webinar control panel. Please feel free to help us as well. Put your questions out there. Happy to talk to you about them, to get them out. We welcome participation. Put them into the questions box, and then we will collect them at the end of Dr. Cross's session. We will discuss all of those. So please don't hesitate. Love to hear your inputs. Just got a note here from Ruth. Yes, of course. Okay. Ted, over to you. Thank you very, very much for volunteering your time today to talk to us at IERG. Very much look forward to your presentation. So with us, no further ado, over to you, sir.
All right, thank you very much. I appreciate you having me, Jock and Ruth. It's been a pleasure getting to know you and your organization. I'm excited to talk about generations in the workplace today. This is a topic, as you mentioned, that is near and dear to my heart and of relevance to many people currently because of the many challenges we're all facing. Now, let me make sure I'm on my presentation here. Okay, good. So, as Jock mentioned, I'm at the Thunderbird School of Global Management. We're always looking at things from a global perspective, and generations is just another one of those topics that we need to examine from a global perspective. But I'd like to start with a personal story. I remember a number of years ago, I was working in an organization, and my boss would always say, Ted, there's a client problem. Please call X or please call this service provider and find out what's going on. And so, my boss would tell me to make a call, and I would go ahead and send an email. And then later, my boss would come back and say, Ted, did you make that call? And I said, well, I sent an email to resolve the problem. And my boss would say, I told you to make a call. And so then I would go and I would send a text message to try to solve the problem. Then my boss would come back again and say, Ted, did you make the call? And I said, well, I sent an email and a text message. And he would say, I said to pick up the phone and make a call. Now, this was, not me just being stubborn. This was a preferred communication style that I had. I was trying to solve a problem in a certain way, but many of you may be familiar with this type of a back and forth with some of your employees or colleagues. As we move from a more analog, traditional work environment to a digital environment, there can be some conflicts. Now, this story shouldn't be a surprise, considering that 75% of Gen Z and millennials now prefer texting over to talking to someone. And this is from some research by LivePerson. Don't worry, at the end of the presentation, we'll give you a copy of the presentation so you can take a look at the references yourself. So there's a changing communication style amongst generations. Technology is influencing this, of course, and whether people are digital natives or digital, converts, someone who has migrated to digital technology over their lifetime. And so this is just highlighting one difference between millennials and Generation Z, for example, and baby boomers that often can create problems in the workplace. And so today, really what I want to talk about is addressing a few different questions about generations in the workplace in general. And usually when I'm asked to do this presentation, the real question I'm being asked is, how do I deal with millennials? And so we will cover some of that, but we need to get some context first on generations in general and where these ideas of generations came from, how we can actually understand some of the context and motivations of different generations, how they might apply globally, and then second, what are some actions we can take as managers and leaders in our organizations. So one of the problems that we're currently experiencing is this truly is one of the first times in history that we have multiple generations in the workplace, all at the same time. Now, it's obvious the reason why this is happening. people are living longer and longer. Life expectancy is increasing. We have people entering the workplace who are younger. We have people who are not retiring because of the Great Recession, the global recession over the last 10, 15 years that we're now fully coming out of. But this created an instance where we have lots of different types of people working together. And we also have to throw in this idea of managing technology and interfacing with new technologies and the rapid pace of change of technology that is shaping the workplace. So just the notion that we have a lot of generations in one place at one time is pretty novel and new. And we haven't been dealing with a problem like this in the past. Yes, we've had some generations working together, but not this many generations working together at once. So quickly, what you can see here is that if you look at global generations, usually they talk about traditionalists, and traditionalists, of course, are folks who are a bit older, and then baby boomers, which we're all familiar with, coming in that time range from 46 to 64, then Generation X and millennials. Now, let me have a caveat here. It depends on which theorist that you subscribe to in the generational area of research, where the cutoff is for each of these generations to start. So they're not real clearly defined, but these are some generalizations. Like, for example, a lot of people would consider that I'm a millennial because I was born in 1980, but if you look at different theorists, they say no, it's 77 like we have here on the screen. And then also they're saying there's a new micro generation now appearing after the millennials, the generation 2000, Generation Z. These are people born after 1997. In general, what we're seeing here is that these generations have different worldviews, often different motivations, especially in the workplace, and have been shaped by different world events. So here's a quick sort of scan of the generations that are currently in the workplace. And you can see here at the bottom, the different generations are in different colors. And you can see that in 2005, the largest generation, of course, was baby boomers in the workplace. There was some traditionals still left. Generation X and millennials were neck and neck. And then as you see projected out, through 2015 and 2020, you see that millennials are beginning to become the largest share of workers in the workforce, and Generation X is a smaller generation, and so it doesn't have as much of share. And then you see almost the complete disappearance of traditionalists. You also notice that baby boomers are decreasing, but they're not decreasing as quickly as other generations in the workplace. And so here again, we have multiple generations, and we have the millennials beginning to take the lion's share of the amount of workers in the workplace. Now, where do these generational theories come from anyways? It's hard to trace back where people started to categorize generations. Some credit Plato, actually, with the first one who's talking about generations, and that those new kids are not as good as we used to be. But really, the modern conception of generations came through Carl Jung and his work on archetypal psychology. And he is basically arguing that, yes, generations can be formed into distinct groups. And like I said, those edges are blurry, but they are shaped by events in their formative years. So whatever happens to a generation during their early formative years of their life often shapes their worldview. Later on, Strauss and Howe in 1991, they took this idea from Jung of archetypal psychology and putting people into archetypes and generations into archetypes, and they came up with what we currently know as generational theory. There's really no agreement on dates, like I mentioned before, and this is something to keep in mind. Many of these theories and generalizations don't hold well across cultures, and this is a warning because we're going to talk about lots of things in general, So that's useful information to be able to see differences, but don't mistake that to be the case in every situation that you might find yourself. So generational theory really is looking at patterns across different age groups and worldview, motivations, and behaviors. And what I'm trying to set up here is that there's a long history of generational theory. This isn't something new, but it is something we've coined lately in the 1990s, and now we're starting to figure out how can we apply it in the modern workplace. So here's some defining events from some research that is very interesting that surveyed what different generations consider to be the most important or formative events of their lives. And you can see for millennials, September 11th was a defining moment. So we just passed the anniversary of that yesterday. But you also see, if you look at the different generations here, that the top three events in their lives are very different. So baby boomers see the JFK assassination as very important and formative in their lives, whereas millennials see the Obama election. You can see that the Iraq-Afghanistan wars affected millennials. You'll see the silent generation. Yes, they still talk about being formed and affected by September 11th, but World War II was a very formative event in their lifetime. And baby boomers have also September 11th, but a number of other different kinds of world events. And so what the generational theorists would argue is that these different world events shape the worldview of the generational outlook. And because of these different worldviews, this is why there's often different values and motivations embedded within generations. Let's take another look at worldview from a political standpoint. This is from the Pew Research Center. You'll see on the left-hand side of your screen that there's a wide ideological divide by generation. So if you look at the very bottom, millennials are actually the most independent, politically minded Americans that we have seen ever so far, and they tend to lean to the left, and they're less conservative than any generation before them. You can see that X has sort of a similar pattern to the millennials in their political views. On the left is consistently liberal and mostly liberal. On the right, consistently conservative or mostly conservative. And then the middle is either independent / mixed. Then you see baby boomers, and you can see this sort of change, but you can see the growth of the middle, the yellow there, over generational time. And then you can also see that there's a change towards the left and also a decrease in the right. And then if you look at partisan affiliation on the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see some interesting trends there. You'll see that millennials are increasingly independent. And this is not just political views. This is actually which parties do people register for here in the US. So are they independent, Democrat, or Republican? And you can see some interesting changes and some huge convergences if you look at the millennial graph there and compare it down to the Xers and the boomers and see how political affiliation has changed rapidly and drastically, actually, over time. Whereas the boomers and the Xers may have been a little bit more close, a third were independent, a third were Democratic, a third were Republican. You're seeing a skew towards independent and millennials and a drop in the Republican Party and sort of a stabilization and decline of the Democratic Party, which I think us as leaders need to pay attention to, because this is informing a worldview. It's an expression of a worldview of a more independent nature in millennials. And you can see that even between millennials and Xers, there's tends to be a very a great difference in political affiliation and partisanship. Here's another interesting graph from the Pew Research Center. This is talking about religious affiliation and whether or not different generations are affiliated officially with a religion. And you can see here, of course, that the silent generation many people, and you can see up to 30% were evangelical Protestants, and mainline Protestants made up over 55% of the generation were affiliated with those groups. And you consistently see as the generations get younger, they are less affiliated with religion and less likely to pertain to one of these denominations. So you have differences in the political spectrum. You have great differences in the way that people are affiliating with a religion and political party, as we mentioned before. And so you have a millennial generation that is more independent, aligned in their political views. They tend to be more liberal in their thought patterns or independent, and then they also are less likely to be affiliated with a formal religious group. Here's another interesting one. This is taken from multiple sources, Pew, and I think the other one is from McKinsey. Marriage rates by generation. These are not surprising. So on the left-hand side of your screen, you see percent married when someone was 18 to 34. Millennials, only 28%. Silent generation, 64% were married when they were 18 to 33. Xers, 38%, and boomers, 49%. So you see an interesting thing here between the silent generation and the boomers. There's a huge drop off, but if you compare boomers to millennials, there's an even similar percentage drop off, but it seems to be as drastic as the drop off from silent generation to boomers. Also, you see percent ever married, and this was a snapshot taken in 2014. Silent generation, 96%. Now, part of the error in this graph is that obviously if you've lived longer, you've had more of a chance, more opportunities to be married over your lifetime. But currently, millennials, only 32% have ever been married. Xers, 81%. Oh, let me mention one more thing on that last slide. The right-hand graphic is interesting because it talks about a little bit about behaviors in the workplace and how the different generations deal with having children and whether or not they take breaks after they have had children. And you can see that millennials are actually the least likely to take a break from work after having children, which honestly flies in the face of many stereotypes that millennials have, that they're lazy or they're not committed. So there is something different here. Actually, there's some interesting research out of the Wharton School of Business and Stuart Friedman on the work-life integration project that he runs there that shows that they did a large survey of Wharton graduates over the last 20 years, and they were interested to find out why was it that millennials, like we saw in previous slides, were less likely to have children. Actually, we'll get to that in a minute. Why were they less likely to have children than previous generations? And when they did the research, they found that millennials, it wasn't that they didn't want to have children, it was that their work demands or their perception of their work demands were in such a way that they felt that they could not do justice to being a parent and working the amount they needed to work to be successful in their workplace. So I think we're seeing a bit of this here in this graph, that millennials are less likely to take a break after having children, probably because they're worried about keeping up in their job and making sure that they're seen as someone who is a hard worker. So here's the second question. Now that we've had some background on the different generations, let's go to motivation. How do I get people to work hard, which is the real question, besides that, how do I deal with millennials? It's how do I actually motivate people? And there's some generational factors. So I remember I was working for a technology company a number of years ago. We provided online services to people remotely, and the corporation had a very strict no work from home policy. So if you look at the right hand side of your screen, you see a picture of a typical open plan office. And we're providing online services to people around the world that make it convenient and use technology to remotely help people with different issues. And the organization said, yes, we are an online service provider, but we're not going to allow any remote workers. We are going to make sure everyone comes into the office, gets on their computers, and helps people that way, so we can keep an eye on everyone. Now, for many Generation Xers and millennials who came into this environment at this company, they were a little bit disappointed because they wanted to have a more flexible schedule. They didn't want to be at the 9 to 5 work schedule. They didn't want to have to come into their cubicle every day, especially considering that we were offering online services that could be done from anywhere in the world. And so why the workers would often ask management, why do we have a no tolerance for working from home or remote workers? So the company did a study, and later what they found was that they could actually pay new employees less if they offered some flexibility of working from home. And this was a generational difference. So Xers and millennials wanted to have flexibility and be able to work from home. The company settled on a hybrid policy where, yes, you did have to come into work some days per week, but there was a set number of days a week that you could work from home as long as you're meeting your success metrics. And so this was an interesting story from my point of view to see how a company could change their behaviors that were often ingrained in a generational worldview of must come to work to have face-to-face time every day, to having some face time and allowing for remote workers and being able to lower the acquisition cost of an employee and also be able to increase productivity because they added some flexibility. So we need to think about the motivations of different generations, and let me again warn that every individual has different motivations, and these are some generalizations that we can draw from, but please make sure that as you're applying these lenses that you're also taking into consideration the idiosyncrasies of different people. So here's an interesting study from Briesman and Rao, and they found that across the globe, becoming a leader is important to 61% of Generation Y, around 61% of Generation Z, and 57% of Generation X. So millennials and Gen Z really are interested in becoming leaders in their organization. They resonate with that word. I know for many baby boomer managers, this can be annoying because millennials are always asserting themselves and looking to become leaders, but this is sort of a worldview motivation. Millennials have been raised in an environment where they have been empowered to become more independent and more leadership oriented, and so this is a great motivation, and if we can tap into this as managers, we can help motivate our younger employees and retain them. So here's different motivations. This is a global survey, and this is looking at who are actually the managers currently, and what share does each generation take. So in India, for example, 85% of managers are in the millennial generation, and boomers make up 57%. If you look at UK, for example, we have a little bit different of a scenario here. Only 50% millennials are in managerial positions, splitting it with Gen X almost exactly. And then if you look at the US, 39%, 37%, and 35%, you can see that there is almost an even third split across there, but you can see in different places in the world, there is a different mix. Now, in general, millennials are in the lion's share of those managerial positions, followed by Generation X, but the distribution is different depending on where you live and the demographics. So I think that's something to take into account. Who is actually in these positions now and who might be moving into those positions later. Now, I also wanted to mention that globally, many younger workers are interested in becoming leaders. They are interested in taking positions of responsibility, but there's different motivations for that. So in general, here's a great quote: Generation Y and X professionals are more enthusiastic about the coaching and mentoring that comes with management jobs than the higher responsibility. So X and Y want coaching and mentoring. That's why they're interested in managerial and leadership positions. And then if you look at Gen Z, they cite higher levels of responsibility and more freedom as the reasons why they would like to become a leader. So if you take those two things into account, if you're dealing with a generation Y or X, they may want more one-on-one mentorship. Not that Generation Z doesn't want this, but they're looking for increased responsibility. They would like to have more opportunities to have freedom and autonomy in their work. And these are different motivations that we can tap into to help retain these employees and help them to grow. So here's another survey I thought was very interesting that asked about what do you actually want in a job? And of course, at the bottom, pay is important to everyone, right? Then you see, working with colleagues is very important next. Flexibility and being on track for a promotion. And I thought that was a very interesting caveat. Being able to work flexibly and still be on track for a promotion. So it's not just that people want flexibility, it's that they're also looking for the opportunity to not get off track, to be able to be promoted and not seen as someone who's not working as hard. I think it's still interesting that pay is very important, but it's followed up by this idea of working with interesting people and being supported in your efforts to work flexibly to meet both my professional and personal goals. So there's a work-life balance aspect that's becoming more and more important to workers across all generations, especially to the younger generations. Now, what I think that is interesting that is changing over the generations is if you look at receiving paid parental leave, there's some drastic differences in the generations on whether or not that's important. Flexibility in work is often very different across generations. And I think it's important to consider the needs of the different individuals that you're working with and whether or not one of these types of ideals might be informing their behaviors or their desires. One way to do that, of course, is take a look at this data first, have the conversation with the individual, and then use some find out questions to see what their individual situation is. Here's some, this is just a fun infographic about motivations across the different generations. So you can see traditionalists are motivated often by money and respect. So titles can be very important and motivating. They have a preferred recognition style. So, subtle, personalized recognition and feedback. They welcome benefits. Of course, everyone wants long-term insurance, but they want catch up on retirement funding if they had lost some of their retirement funding in the stock market crash of 07-08. Another thing that's interesting about traditionalists is I would say this is the group that would often work for 20 years for a company or 30 years for a company, very loyal, and they would often work for the company. Yes, they're working for title, but this is when things like getting the gold watch after 20 years or the special party for 10 years or the 10-year pen, those kinds of things really worked. I don't think those things work as well now with new generations, but they really did work with traditionalists. Baby boomers still are motivated by money. We all want to be paid, but also value flexible retirement planning and peer recognition. So they want to be respected by their peers. They want to be recognized, yes, by their bosses, but they want peer recognition. So how can you build in some peer recognition? Do we recognize baby boomers' efforts in front of other people? Preferred recognition style, acknowledgement of input and expertise. They want prestigious job titles. So here's the interesting one: parking places and office size as measures of success. So in this research, they found that this was a proxy for success, often like maybe a nice car, but also the parking spot, right? Do you have a reserved parking spot, or do you have the big office? Generation X values bonuses and stock options. So here's a generation that came really into their own during maybe the .com era and the startup era, and are interested in being owners in a company, part owners in a company through equity stakes. Not enough just to have a loyal sort of company to be part of, but also want to be part of owning that company. This also may be a reflection of sort of what we've seen default rates in pension plans and things like that. That Generation X has seen that has not worked out well for many traditionalists and boomers, and so they are interested in having equity stakes and being able to make money that way to save for retirement. Preferred recognition style, informal. They want rapid feedback and they want it publicly communicated. I think that's very interesting. And then Generation Y also wants stock options. Feedback can be they also want non-monetary recognitions. They want to be recognized on social media, informally and formally, and they want a flexible schedule. As people move into jobs in Generation Y, what they're also looking for on many surveys that I've looked at is meaningful work. So they want to work for a company that has not just corporate social responsibility, but also has values, what we call the double bottom line. They're doing good and doing well, the company, and they want to be part of those kinds of organizations. Generation Z, of course, likes money, but as we mentioned, they want to be given more responsibility. They would like to be recognized regularly, and they value, which I think was a big difference, different training. Here at ASU, we have recently started a partnership with Starbucks to offer online college courses to all of Starbucks US employees, and this has been a great retention tool for Starbucks. They had of course, wanted to retain their baristas, and as they offered them benefits for online education and training through ASU, they're able to retain their employees longer. Now, I always say it's nice to understand some of these different aspects of motivation, but one of the problems with the research is that it's self-reported. And so I often say we need to believe what people do and buy, not what they say. So let's see some buying behaviors and some action behaviors. Here's an interesting graphic. Generations, do you play video games? This is actually we can track players now online, and you can see, look at the large 50 some percent of millennials do, not so much for Generation X, and baby boomers, of course, aren't playing video games, but you can see these are digitally inclined people, and they're online and they're playing video games. It's just a wholly different culture. I know that there's often talk here in the States about the National Football League and whether or not that will survive in the next 20 years because of the rise of esports. This is the idea of people getting together online and being able to play sports video games, and now they are broadcasting those, and they are generating lots and lots of revenue by broadcasting and making sort of like Super Bowl type events for video gamers. Here's interesting rental and house purchasing behaviors. So this is percent of renters who plan to buy a home someday. So they're currently renting and they want to buy a house. 18 to 34, 93%, 75% of 35 to 44. And of course, if you're older and you're renting, you're probably thinking, no, I don't want to buy a house because I'm fine the way I am. So younger people do want to buy homes, but it gets less realistic for people as they are older. However, Here's an interesting contrast. Renters as a percentage of the total population, 25 to 34. So in 05, 52% of people were renters. In 2013, that jumped to 60%. Some of this has to do with the recession. But also you see on your right-hand side, percentage of adults 18 to 31 married and living in their own household. So not only are people renting more, but you see that the percentage goes down on the right-hand side of your screen of those who are living in their own household. So you often hear, of course, about the younger generations moving back into their parents' homes, and this is sort of what this data is showing, but it's not that they don't want to buy a home, it's not that they're not wanting to form their own household. It's often a function of larger amounts of debt, student loans here in the US, for example, and the recession. But there is a large difference in the generations and this sort of coming of age time and how households are being formed. Another thing I'll point out here as I begin to wrap up is that millennials are actually less and less concerned about ownership. So like we saw in some of those graphs about housing, purchasing, and renting, even though folks may, and the younger generations may want to buy houses, they actually aren't buying as many houses. And they're also not just doing that sort of behavior in the home buying area. If you look at this slide on the left-hand side, it says millennials have been reluctant to buy items such as cars. So we've seen a rise in sharing of cars and Uber and things like that, music and luxury goods. Instead, they're turning to a new set of services that provide access to products without the burdens of ownership and the rise of the sharing economy. So on the right-hand side, I have Airbnb. You don't have to use hotels anymore, but you might have access to luxury properties through Airbnb. There's even services now that I've seen that allow you to access power tools. Instead of owning your own power tools or owning your own set of tools, you can actually just share those, belong to a subscription service that allows you access to those whenever you need them. You also have seen people begin to not own lots of physical books. So you might have access to Audible, the subscription, or an online library that's a subscription, Netflix, Hulu, these different ideas of having access. And so look at Jeremy Rifkin's quote at the bottom on the left-hand side, where he says, 25 years from now, car sharing will be the norm and car ownership an anomaly. So I've even noticed that different car companies are starting to experiment with things beyond the traditional purchase or the traditional lease option into micro leases or subscription models to access the cars. I've even seen, of course, around here in Phoenix where Thunderbird is, we have a number of car sharing and ride sharing services. We also have streets littered with shareable bikes, and now the new rage is these electric scooters that anyone can pick up. And the idea is to tap into sort of the millennial and the even younger generation Z's, their desire to have access to things without having to bear the burden or the upfront costs of ownership. Now, to end here, I just wanted to say that you can't categorize everyone, and the real question is, are you curious enough to tolerate difference in the workplace and learn about others? So we've talked about some great motivators across generations, some different world events that may have shaped worldviews of different generations. But the real question you have to ask yourself is, how curious are you and how willing are you to get to know different people from different generations and recognize going into those conversations that there will be differences, and how flexible can you be as a manager and leader to use different tactics and techniques from what you find out through your own personal interactions and through learning such as this to help others feel more motivated. Now, if you like these kinds of topics, we at Thunderbird do offer a 30 credit online degree in leadership and management. feel free to contact us about that for more information. And my contact information is here at the end. Thank you for having me. I'm glad to answer some questions, and I'll turn the time over to Jock and Ruth.
So thank you very much. You know, I've listened to many presentations before. I've taken part in surveys regarding generations in the workplace, but this has certainly been the most informative if you look at the statistics and kind of behavioral patterns. Thank you very much for sharing this. I've certainly learned a lot today. One of the things I learned at the beginning, you talked about your real life situation about you not wanting to make that phone call. Now, I work in a recruitment environment, and the recruiter working with me is younger. Obviously, will fall into a younger generation, and I just couldn't figure out why are they not making the call. They are sending text or emails, and that explains it. You know, it is a behavioral pattern, and that also means that the people that they are approaching as a candidate, if they are in that generation, they're probably more likely to respond to a text message because they're always on their phones, rather than an email, because kind of, you know, people just don't log into emails anymore. So it kind of, the bell rang true for me. You know, thank you very much for highlighting that.
Of course.
You mentioned also that generations are, the kind of categorization is not necessarily equal in all regions or geographies. Do you know, can you comment on, are there any specific geographies or regions or cultures broadly defined where perhaps the emphasis and definition of different generations is more acute and more problematic than not? Is there such a differentiation?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think one of the aspects to take into consideration is how hierarchical culture is, so taking cultural considerations into account. And so in hierarchical cultures, maybe in China or Japan, there could be greater differences among the generations depending on how traditional a generation identifies with the dominant culture over time. So that's one aspect to take into account. Another thing to take into account is the sheer demographics of when we looked at one of those slides back where it showed the number of managers in any given generation across different countries. So part of it is sheer demographics, right? So in the US, they're split, you know, baby boomer, Generation X, and millennials, a third in managerial positions. But in other places in the world, there is a more skewed distribution of people who are in those managerial positions. And so what can happen is that if one generation is more represented in a managerial or leadership position, their worldview might tend to dominate that country's workplace culture. So if lots of millennials are now in charge, you'll start to see, not right away, but a lagging indicator of their worldview beginning to shape the workplace. But in other places where Generation X and baby boomers are still holding the most positions of power, you'll still see some of those worldviews coming through.
Just please explain something to me on that very same graph, Ted. You said in the US like third, but in India, I think it was the top left-hand one was like, you know, 87 or 67%, 67, it doesn't add up to 100. Just explain to me kind of what that means.
It's just showing they're surveying the percentage breakdown of the number of workers in managerial positions. So 60-some% who hold managerial positions are quote unquote identified as millennials. So they're seeing a rise in millennials being able to hold more positions in the managerial workplace, as managers or leaders than other places in the country or in the world rather. And you see, you know, in the US that it's more evenly distributed. And a lot of that has to do with where are the places that in the world that have high birth rates. So if you have a lower birth rate, your generational demographics might look similar in that the cohorts might be equal sized. But in places where there's high birth rates, you're going to see larger numbers of a sort of regular pyramid-shaped demographic, where the younger generation is larger than the older generations. But in places like Japan, places like the US, where birth rates are lower, you will see a either sort of a straight box sort of shaped graph of demographics, or even an inverted pyramid.
All right. I've never seen the generational mix. I've never seen the silent generation. I think elsewhere they also refer to as traditionalists.
Yes.
These are the folks who are sort of, who should have been retired and who refuse to retire. Am I right?
Right. Right. So the problem is, of course, that because of the Great Recession, we still have many silent generation or traditionalists in the workplace, especially in. Let me just give you an example. I had a boss a while back, and he's technically a baby boomer, but he holds a position of power. We asked him how much longer is he going to work. He said 10 more years. He's already closing in on 70.
Right.
So he's going to be, 80 years old in his mind before, his plan is to retire. And so some of the conflict that happens in the workplace is younger generations getting anxious because they would like some of these upper positions that are not being vacated by people.
Right. We have a comment, two questions here from Michael Gentle. Thanks also for asking that question. So that was the basis of that. Question from Betty Flash, one of our board members. Can you comment on company loyalty or identification with one's company versus a more transactional relationship between employee and company? What is it if you look across the generations?
It's a great question. The big question in this research that always comes up is, are millennials job hoppers? Are they moving from working 1 year or 6 months at one organization, then going to the next? And what we find actually is that in the US at least, the average for all generations, the average number of years that a worker stays at a job currently is around 3.2 or 4, close to 4 years. And so if you look at that historically, if you look at the 1980s, that's about the same. So it hasn't changed that much actually. And when they survey millennials, they're actually more likely to want to stay at a company than when they look at baby boomers. So they're more actually loyal if, and this is the big caveat, that they feel that sort of the company that they're at has some sort of greater purpose. So it has that double bottom line I mentioned of doing good and doing well. So some sort of social impact or some way that you can map on your company's or organization's product onto something larger than just making money. And so there is a tendency, though, among millennials to be less loyal in the sense that what has changed, and this was interesting, this was a survey that a business dean did at a different school, and what they found was that we need to prepare students not just for the 2 or 3 different jobs that they'll have in their lifetime, but now the 2 or 3 different careers that they'll have in their lifetime. So it's now more common not just to move from one job to another, but also to move from one sector to another. So there's less separation of sectors.
Okay, thanks, Ted. A question from Michael Farmer. In the data presented, it appears that we saw that what people wanted, particularly millennials. So what are their kind of demands of the workforce? But little reference as to how these wants were going to be paid for and supported by millennials. It appears that there's a dependency on their predecessors. I would imagine that means the older generations. Please comment and clarify.
So one of the problems with the millennial generation is that real wages have stagnated for them and cost of living have increased. And so they're looking for corporations, organizations, or governments to be able to pitch in to help them with certain things that may have not been, on the table in previous generations. Like I mentioned with the example with Starbucks, one thing that millennials are demanding is the access to, and Generation Z also, continuing education because of the rapid changing nature of the workplace. They want to upskill constantly, and they're relying on wanting the different organizations they work for to provide that. So that's a shift in benefit. So it's not just healthcare, it's now educational benefits are important to younger people. And to your question about how do they think these things are going to get paid for, frankly, many millennials have the view that this should be part and parcel of corporate social responsibility. They also are putting pressure on governments all over the world to provide lower cost higher education opportunities and sort of aid or relief for different types of housing burdens or rent control propositions and these kinds of measures.
Okay. One last question before we sign off. Can you comment on HR and management conflicts that US multinationals have to deal with in light of the major differences across major regions of the world?
Yes. So not only do we have Yes, not only do we have different generational differences and cultural differences and different conflicts, but as we were mentioning in our example, Jock, of millennials not wanting to communicate via phone or face-to-face often, this can also come off as a passive-aggressive conflict style. And so how do we actually bring people in, if we're HR professionals, to work out differences? One thing I would recommend is, especially if you're working across cultures and you're working across different generations, as a second curveball, examining the motivations of an archetypal sort of matrix and a cultural high dominance, low dominance, hierarchical or low hierarchical matrix, and then saying, okay, what are the values and the norms of these people who are having conflict? Is this conflict caused by a misalignment of worldview? And how might I be a mediator of helping to explain different worldviews, even though those people might not know consciously that their conflict arises from an unseen or unconscious mind map that they have?
So on that nugget of wonderful advice, thank you very, very much on behalf of IERG for your time spent. Hugely informative. Of course, everyone on the call today will get a link to the webinar on our YouTube channel that you can have a look again later. The slides are so detailed. There's so much information on there, Ted, so it'll be great to kind of really look at them and kind of see what's on there and kind of chew them over a bit. Thank you so much for shedding light on this really, really important issue. Great to have you as a guest of IERG today. Thank you everyone for dialing in. Great. I would love to have you back and continue this conversation. Next month, we're going to have a really, really good event as well. We will send out invitations probably early next week, Ruth. So thanks all for dialing in. Have yourselves a great day. And one more time, Dr. Ted Cross on behalf of IERG, really appreciate your time. Good night. Good afternoon, everyone. Wishing you a fantastic day. Thanks for dialing in.